The South Atlantic at dawn is a cold, colorless place. The horizon blurs into a steel-gray smear, the kind that makes even veteran pilots feel small and alone. On the morning of May 21st, 1982, an Argentine A4 Skyhawk sliced low across that gray world, its pilot gripping the stick so tightly his knuckles blanched inside his glove. Salt spray from the waves flicked against his canopy as he skimmed barely meters above the water, pushing the jet right to the edge of its fuel limits. Straight ahead lay San Carlos Water, soon to be known to both sides as Bomb Alley. He had been told the British fighters weren't the real threat. The Navy briefings had repeated it over and over. Sea Harriers are slow, short range, limited radar, nothing like a mirage. Many pilots believed it. They saw the Harrier as a stubby little jump jet. Clever engineering, sure, but hardly a match for a fast, hard-hitting strike aircraft. The real fear came from the ships. Radar-guided Sea Dart missiles, Rapier batteries on the ground, layers of anti-aircraft fire that could claw a Skyhawk out of the air before it ever reached its target. But fighters? No, those weren't supposed to be the problem. Still, the pilot couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His gut tightened as he popped up slightly to check his position. The water below briefly caught the morning light, shimmering silver. Through that thin glow, he could almost make out the British landing fleet cluttering the fjord. Frigates, transports, troops moving ashore. A strike here could change the day's battle, maybe the war. Just a few more seconds. A little higher, identify the target, release the bombs. Then it happened. A warning tone, shrill, urgent, unmistakable, sliced through the cockpit. Before he could even process it, a flash of white streaked across his peripheral vision. It wasn't the warm orange of anti-aircraft fire. It was something colder, faster, purposeful. A missile. There was no time to brake, no altitude to dive. In that razor-thin space between awareness and annihilation, he realized the truth. The Sea Harrier was here. Far above, nearly invisible against the cloud deck, a Royal Navy Sea Harrier FRS.1 held the firing position. Inside, the British pilot breathed slow and steady, his voice calm over the radio as he thumbed the trigger. The missile he had just launched wasn't the old rear aspect Sidewinder everyone expected. This was the AIM-9L. An all-aspect hunter that could lock on to heat from the nose, the wings, even the reflection off a rising aircraft's metal skin. It didn't matter that the Skyhawk pilot never saw the Harrier. The missile painted his aircraft with perfect clarity. A heartbeat later, the sky bloomed into fire. On ships below, Royal Navy sailors glanced up at the explosion, another inbound strike that wouldn't reach them. On the Argentine mainland, air controllers waited for a radio call that would never come. And on the flight deck of HMS Hermes, a Sea Harrier taxied into position for launch, its pilot watching the cloud wall ahead as though it were a living thing. In the weeks to come, scenes like this would repeat again and again. Fast Argentine jets would race into the fight, brave, determined, and dangerously low on fuel, only to vanish mid-run, erased by missiles fired from fighters they had been told were slow, limited, even primitive. They were wrong. In the frigid skies above the Falklands, the supposedly outmatched Sea Harrier would carve out one of the most dominant air-to-air records in modern history. And the weapon that made it possible, a sleek white dart named Sidewinder, would change everything. The story of the Sea Harrier's dominance in the Falklands cannot be understood without first stepping back into the tense political climate of 1982, the year a remote chain of windswept islands became the center of a global crisis. For Argentina, the Falklands, Las Malvinas, represented a painful wound stretching back to the 19th century, a territorial claim entwined with national pride. For Britain, the islands were a distant remnant of empire, sparsely populated and strategically modest, but unmistakably British soil. When the Argentine junta invaded on April 2nd, they expected a short, decisive occupation. What they received instead was something few nations would have dared: a British task force sailing 8,000 miles into the South Atlantic to fight a modern war at the edge of the world. On paper, the air balance looked grim for the British. Argentina possessed a surprisingly capable air arm, high-speed Mirage III interceptors, Israeli-built Dagger fighters, battle-proven A4 Skyhawks in both Navy and Air Force variants, Canberra bombers, and rugged Pucará counterinsurgency aircraft that could operate from rough forward airstrips. Argentine pilots were young, aggressive, and trained in Cold War doctrine, fast climbs, high-altitude intercepts, rapid strike profiles. What they lacked in equipment modernization, they made up for in bravery and boldness. More importantly, they had something Britain did not: land bases. Large fixed airfields on the mainland meant Argentina's jets could launch in large numbers, turn quickly, and maintain a steady tempo of operations, at least in theory. The problem, as the war would reveal, was distance. Every Argentine pilot flying to the Falklands was effectively climbing into a time bomb. Fuel margins were razor thin. Attack runs had to be executed within minutes. Any dogfight, any deviation, any mistake could mean running dry over freezing seas with no hope of rescue. Britain's air defense, by contrast, hinged on two small carriers, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. From their decks operated the aircraft many Argentines underestimated, the Sea Harrier FRS.1. It was a peculiar-looking fighter by the standards of the era. It lacked the sleek lines of a Mirage or the brute presence of a Phantom. It was subsonic. Its radar, the Blue Fox, was modest in power. It carried only 2 air-to-air missiles. To pilots trained in classical jet combat, the Harrier seemed like a compromise, an engineering experiment that happened to fly. Even within the Royal Navy, the Sea Harrier had been controversial. Traditionalists argued that Britain needed large carriers with F-4 Phantoms or F-14 Tomcats, not a jump jet adaptation designed for austerity. The Harrier had been sold as a multi-role, flexible tool for limited conflicts, not a frontline air superiority fighter. Certainly not one meant to challenge an entire national air force. But beneath that dismissive reputation lay a machine with 2 major advantages. First, astonishing maneuverability. At subsonic speeds, the Harrier could outturn most aircraft of its era, leveraging its thrust vectoring nozzles to create angles and attack positions that simply should not have been possible. In the hands of a skilled pilot, the Sea Harrier could pivot, climb, and cut across the sky like no conventional fighter. Second, and far more decisive in 1982, was a weapon few outside NATO knew it could carry: the AIM-9L Sidewinder. Until then, most infrared-guided missiles required a rear aspect shot. They could only home in on the heat signature of an engine's exhaust. Pilots trained accordingly. Never let an enemy get behind you. Keep your tail cold in the notch of the sky. The AIM-9L changed the rules overnight. Its seeker head was far more sensitive. It could track heat from any direction: nose, wings, even reflections from metal heated by aerodynamic friction. For the first time in air combat history, a heat-seeking missile was truly all-aspect. And Britain had it. Argentina did not. The delivery of the AIM-9Ls was a political and logistical miracle. The U.S. quietly approved an emergency transfer. Missiles were flown to the United Kingdom, rushed through adaptation, and loaded aboard the carriers en route. Many Argentine intelligence assessments still assumed the British carried the older AIM-9G or 9H variants. That outdated assumption, combined with ingrained cultural biases about subsonic jump jets, meant that Argentine pilots entered the conflict expecting dogfights resembling those of earlier decades. They were wrong. Meanwhile, Argentine aircrews practiced for a different kind of fight entirely. Their training emphasized high-speed penetration, not twisting engagements. They knew that British ships were protected by multiple layers of air defenses. They believed, reasonably, that their greatest threat would be Sea Dart missiles from destroyers or Rapier batteries on the ground. Argentine pilots trained to fly incredibly low, sometimes just a few meters above the waves, to mask themselves from radar and give British missiles less time to react. What they did not plan for was a highly maneuverable fighter appearing out of the clouds at unexpected angles, guided by shipborne radar controllers, armed with a missile that didn't care whether the target was facing it or fleeing. In short, both countries entered the Falklands War burdened with assumptions. Britain believed its Sea Harriers would be stretched to the limit. Argentina believed its numerical superiority and fast jets would dominate. But in the cold skies above the islands, where fuel was short and reaction times were measured in seconds, it would be tactics, training, and technology, especially the AIM-9L, that rewrote the balance of power. And soon, Argentine pilots would encounter the shock that comes from underestimating an enemy. When the British task force departed home waters in early April 1982, no one on board could fully predict the kind of war they were about to fight. But the Royal Navy understood two truths immediately. They were thousands of miles from support, and their survival depended entirely on establishing at least a bubble of air superiority around the fleet. The evolution of that effort, from early uncertainty to a relentless, disciplined rhythm of combat air patrols, forms the backbone of the Falklands Air War. As HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible churned through rough Atlantic waters, Sea Harrier squadrons used every spare moment to practice the kind of flying the coming fight demanded. The pilots knew they were badly outnumbered. They also knew their jets' strengths: tight turning, abrupt pitch changes, and the ability to vector in, thrust to pivot inside a Mirage's turning circle. But raw maneuverability wouldn't win the war alone. The British began developing a new method of intercept control, one built around continuous radar support from ships. Because the Sea Harrier's Blue Fox radar had limited range and struggled against low-flying targets, the fighter would rarely find the enemy itself. Instead, Type 42 destroyers and other escorts would detect inbound raids and guide the Harriers precisely, vectoring them like pieces on a chessboard. This integration became the first major adaptation. The second was more subtle. Sea Harrier pilots began rehearsing offensive missile shots at angles no Sidewinder had ever been expected to achieve. Because they carried AIM-9L 7s, they could fire before the enemy passed them, not just from behind. That single change meant a Sea Harrier didn't need to outspeed a Mirage. It just needed to get within weapon parameters, and the ships would help it get there. Dawn on May 1st marked the first major combat over the Falklands. Argentine daggers streaked toward the British fleet, while Mirages patrolled higher altitudes, hoping to lure Harriers upward and away from the ships. The British, aware of the trap, refused to bite. Instead, radar controllers fed precise intercept vectors to the Cap pair on station. The first kills came quickly. The Sea Harrier's Sidewinders hit daggers and a Mirage within seconds of launch, shocking the Argentine pilots involved. Some never saw the Harriers that killed them. Others attempted evasive maneuvers that would have defeated older missiles, but were no match for the AIM-9L's hungry seeker. The lesson was immediate and brutal. Altitude alone would not protect them, nor would speed. Argentine commanders adjusted rapidly. Mirages were ordered to avoid turning fights and to stay high, conserving fuel. Daggers and Skyhawks were assigned to conduct low-level attack missions where they could hide in the radar clutter. It was a logical shift, but one that unintentionally pushed them straight into the Sea Harrier's strengths. For Argentina, each mission to the Falklands was a race against the clock. From the moment a Skyhawk or Dagger lifted off, its fuel countdown began. Long flights over cold water meant they arrived over the islands with only minutes to spare. There was virtually no room for dogfighting, and absolutely no room for searching for targets or repeating an attack run. This operational necessity forced almost all Argentine raids to follow predictable patterns: low ingress, rapid pop-up, bomb release, and immediate egress. Predictability, however, is death in air combat. British controllers monitored radar screens constantly. When a group of low-flying attackers entered the Cap grid, the controllers would snap vectors at the Sea Harriers. Turn 270, Angels 10, your targets are approaching at high speed. Harriers would then dive, accelerate, and emerge from cloud cover in front or alongside the attackers. The Argentine pilots, razor-focused on surviving the gauntlet of ship defenses, often never saw the fighters closing in. Fuel constraints also meant damaged Argentine aircraft rarely made it home. Even minor battle damage, holes, leaks, aerodynamic drag could spell the end before they reached the coastline. Every kilometer they flew was bought with minutes they didn't have. When the British amphibious force entered San Carlos water, it set off the most intense phase of the air war. The narrow fjords turned ships into perfect targets for low-level attackers. Argentine Skyhawks and daggers launched wave after wave of daring strikes, threading between hills and skipping across the water to reach the landing force. Sea Harriers were everywhere. Operating in rotating pairs, they dashed from their cap stations to intercept each inbound raid. The ship's radars guided them. The AIM-9Ls empowered them. Many Skyhawks fell before they even began their attack dive. Others released bombs but were intercepted on their way out, still vulnerable, low on fuel, and flying predictable escape routes. San Carlos became a graveyard for aircraft on both sides. British ships took severe hits, losing lives and hulls. But if the Sea Harriers had not held the skies, the landings might have been impossible. By the end of the day, pilots on both sides recognized a grim truth. The Harriers were not a nuisance, they were a dominant force. As the war dragged into June, a rhythm emerged. Argentine pilots launched attack missions with stoic determination. British pilots ate cold meals on carrier decks, waiting for the next scramble. Both sides were exhausted. Every day felt like an echo of the one before. Low-flying attackers racing to their targets, Harriers swooping from cloud cover, ships firing upward in desperate arcs of tracer fire. But only one side was wearing down the other. The Sea Harrier's kill count climbed relentlessly. The combination of shipborne radar, disciplined KP patterns, aggressive pilot skill, and the AIM-9L's all-aspect capability produced results that defied pre-war expectations. By mid-June, Argentina's ability to challenge British air dominance was fading rapidly. The skies were being cleared, one missile streak at a time. The first day of the war set the tone for everything that followed. Argentine pilots launched with confidence. Their Mirages and daggers were fast, sleek, and elegant fighters, classic interceptors designed to dominate the high-altitude realm. Many believed the Sea Harrier, a stubby subsonic jump jet, would be little more than a nuisance. Then, within seconds of the first merge, a dagger of white smoke sliced across the sky. A Sea Harrier, positioned perfectly by shipborne radar control, fired an AIM-9L Sidewinder at long range before the Argentine pilot even began his defensive break. The missile struck home in a ball of fire. The second Harrier scored another kill moments later. In Argentine briefings that night, pilots described the experience with disbelief. They fired from the front. We never even saw them. The missile followed me into the sun. These weren't exaggerations. The AIM-9L could track heat from any angle, and its seeker was so sensitive it could distinguish aircraft from background terrain. Argentine doctrine, based on outmaneuvering older rear aspect missiles, was instantly outdated. It was the day Argentina realized the skies over the Falklands would not behave the way their training said they should. On May 1st and again on subsequent days, Argentine commanders attempted a classic tactic: use Mirages at high altitude to draw the Sea Harriers upward. If the British fighters took the bait, Skyhawks and daggers could slip beneath them and attack the fleet with minimal interference. The British didn't bite. KP pairs stayed low and close to the task force, ignoring the Mirages unless they committed to an attack. Forced to engage or retreat, the Mirages dove after the Harriers to avoid losing initiative. This brought them into Sidewinder range, an arena where the British jet thrived. One Mirage squadron commander later admitted, "They refused to play our game. They forced us to play theirs." This was the second turning point. The Sea Harriers dictated the terms of engagement, not the other way around. The landings at San Carlos transformed the conflict. Argentine aircraft had to attack. There was no choice. If the British established a beachhead, they could bring artillery, armor, and infantry ashore, making the liberation of the islands inevitable. Every squadron available launched. Some flew 4 to 6 sorties a day. They came in low, hugging the water, flying between hills so tight that terrain following was a matter of nerve, not avionics. But San Carlos was a trap of British design. The narrow inlets forced attackers into predictable approach paths, and the Sea Harriers waited at the exits where fuel-starved Argentine aircraft had no room to evade and no time to fight. This was the day that broke the illusion of Argentine air superiority. Skyhawks were cut down in groups. Daggers failed to return home. Pilots who survived described the same nightmare. You released your bombs, pulled away, and then the Harriers were simply there, sliding into position like sharks in dark water. San Carlos marked the moment when Argentine air power shifted from offensive weapon to attrition force. Every loss hurt. Every pilot shot down was one less who could be replaced. The British, meanwhile, kept flying. By early June, Argentine pilots were exhausted. Every mission required courage bordering on fatalism. They knew roughly how long they would last in the combat zone, 2 to 3 minutes. They knew the Harriers were out there, and they knew the Sidewinders could hit from any angle. One pilot later stated, "You learn to fly as if death was one mistake away, but with the Harriers, sometimes there was no mistake." Sea Harrier pilots felt the pressure too. They lost friends and ships. They flew in brutal weather. They slept in freezing quarters on pitching decks, and they knew the landings depended entirely on their ability to stop just one Skyhawk from getting through at the wrong moment. But the psychological momentum had shifted entirely to the British. By this point, intercept geometry had become instinctive. Pilots trusted their controllers. They trusted the missile. They trusted the jet. Argentine pilots still fought with bravery, no one disputes, but bravery couldn't rewrite physics. On June 8th, Argentine A-4 Skyhawks executed one of the most successful strikes of the war, crippling the logistic ships Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram at Bluff Cove. It was a triumph of courage and skill, but it also marked Argentina's last major air success and their final strategic turning point. The strike was costly. Pilots were lost, aircraft were lost, and those losses mattered in a way the British could absorb, but Argentina could not. The war was now a battle of stamina, and Argentina's air force was bleeding out. After June 8th, their operational tempo collapsed. Many squadrons simply lacked surviving aircraft or trained pilots to continue sustained operations. Others could not reach the islands due to maintenance and fuel shortages. Meanwhile, the Sea Harriers still flew near constant cap, intercepting scattered raids and securing uncontested control of the air as British ground forces advanced on Stanley. The skies were nearly empty by the time British troops reached Wireless Ridge. The air war was effectively over. On June 14th, the day Argentine forces in Stanley surrendered, pilots on the mainland responded with a kind of stunned silence. Many expressed admiration for the Sea Harrier in interviews years later. Almost all described the AIM-9L as the weapon that changed the war. One pilot summarized it simply: "We underestimated the aircraft, we underestimated the missile, and we underestimated the men who flew them." This was the final turning point. The Sea Harrier had gone from curiosity to myth. Most air wars are fought at altitude. The Falklands was not one of them. Argentine pilots were ordered to attack the British fleet at ultra-low level, often under 50 feet, sometimes so low that waves slapped their landing gear doors. Their jets weren't built for this. The A-4 Skyhawk excelled at high-speed strike missions, but flying at sea, skimming altitude demanded constant precision. A momentary lapse, a rogue gust, or a misjudged wave trough could be fatal. And yet they flew this way every day, because if they climbed, even for a moment, they became visible to the Sea Harriers circling above. British pilots called these attacks rabbit runs because spotting a skyhawk in the troughs was like spotting an animal darting between brush. The radar couldn't see them. The ships couldn't track them until they were almost overhead. Only the Harriers, with their vectored thrust and tight turning ability, had a chance to intercept. Sea Harrier pilot Lieutenant Clive Morrell described it as finding a needle that's trying not to be found. Most intercepts lasted seconds. On May 23rd, Lieutenant Jeff Glover and his wingman were vectored toward a fast-moving contact, a lone dagger screaming toward San Carlos. The Argentine pilot had slipped past radar for nearly 40 miles, weaving through terrain, using every trick he knew. Glover spotted him just as the dagger popped above a ridgeline. He called out, "Tally-ho, one dagger, low." The Argentine pilot pulled hard into a break, dumping altitude, trying to force Glover to overshoot. It should have worked. The dagger was faster, especially in level flight. Both sides feared an air-to-air duel between Sea Harriers and Argentina's Super Etendards, the jet that carried the Exocet. But these fights never happened. The Etendards launched from extreme range, fired their missiles and raced home on fumes. Harriers never reached firing distance. This absence became part of the legend. A weapon feared but rarely seen, and a fighter feared because it was seen too often. While Argentine pilots fought long missions with minimal avionics, British pilots faced something equally punishing: constant alert status. Sea Harriers were few in number, only 20 Sea Harriers at the war's start, and every loss was catastrophic. Pilots often slept in full gear. Takeoffs were launched in storms. Decks pitched violently in the freezing South Atlantic. At times, jets returned with nearly empty tanks, fumes sloshing in the lines, engines coughing. Mechanical failure over hostile water meant death. But turning back meant an Argentine jet getting through. Many nights, pilots asked their mechanics quietly, "Is she going to hold together one more flight?" And most nights, the answer, spoken or implied, was, "She has to." One of the most intense engagements occurred when Sea Doctor Nigel Ward engaged two Mirages that had previously set a trap for British fighters. This time, Ward flew in low, drawing them downward where the Mirage Delta wing struggled. Ward pulled a climbing turn, vectored thrust, and at the apex rolled inverted with gravity and thrust working together. A perfect firing position. The AIM-9L streaked away and obliterated the first Mirage. The second fled for the mainland, fuel nearly gone. Ward did not pursue. Doing so would mean ditching in freezing water. Even the most aggressive Harrier pilots respected the cold more than the enemy. Both sides forged deep camaraderie, pilots who understood that every sortie could be their last. British pilots signed messages on bombs. Argentine pilots shared rosaries before takeoff. Both wrote notes home they prayed no one would ever have to read. Years later, many of them met at reunions and commemorations. And something remarkable happened. The bitterness had faded. The respect remained. Former enemies embraced, laughed, and traded stories of moments when their aircraft and their luck had nearly failed them. Argentine pilot Pablo Carballo once said, "We fought like lions, all of us. The Harrier pilots too. We were young, we were brave, and we survived the same storm." For Argentine aviators, every mission carried the same grim arithmetic. Fuel for 400 miles out, minutes over the target, barely enough fuel to get home, no tanker support, no second chances. Even before they met the Sea Harrier, the stress was enormous. But once the AIM-9L Sidewinder began taking aircraft from angles no pilot had trained against, the psychological toll deepened. Pilots began speaking of the silent threat. You didn't see the Harrier, you didn't hear the missile, you only saw the flash, if you saw anything at all. Veterans later admitted that on certain flight lines, men avoided eye contact before launching. Not because of fear of death, every pilot accepted that, but because no one wanted to burden a friend with their own doubts. One Argentine pilot summarized the feeling: You flew with certainty of death, but you fought for the small chance of success. This wasn't dramatization, it was the truth. Each sortie was a one-way sprint into a maze of missile trails, cannons, and cold gray water waiting below. The Sea Harrier pilots lived with a different pressure, one tied to responsibility rather than survival. They weren't just flying intercept missions, they were the shield. Every Argentine jet that slipped through meant a ship struck, Marines killed, the landing force endangered. The Royal Navy simply didn't have enough fighters. Every Sea Harrier mattered, every pilot mattered, and every minute in the air was another minute a small carrier deck was waiting for them to return. Some pilots paced the cramped ready rooms, rehearsing intercept geometry in their minds. Others sat silently, hands on helmets, listening to the deck vibrate under their boots. A few admitted later, the fear wasn't dying, it was failing. That psychological load, knowing the lives of thousands depended on their ability to find and destroy the incoming jets, was a quiet pressure few outside the cockpit ever understood. As losses mounted, something unusual happened. They spoke of it with a blend of frustration and admiration. It turned like nothing else. It appeared out of nowhere. It fired from impossible angles. Some compared the Sidewinders' sudden white streak to a predator's strike, silent until the moment of impact. They talked about the Skyhawk pilots who held their attack run under walls of gunfire. They admired the mirages that dove into fights they knew were stacked against them. They respected the daggers that charged through SAM envelopes to reach the landing fleet. Both sides were fighting the same war, and both found pieces of themselves reflected in their enemies. That mutual respect would last long after the shooting stopped. Years later, veterans on both sides described the same sensation when the war ended. A sudden silence. After weeks of noise, jet engines, missile launches, AAA bursts, radio calls, there was nothing but the strange hollow quiet of a war that ended as abruptly as it began. Some pilots never flew again. Some struggled with survivor's guilt. Some returned to the sky and found peace in flight. But all carried the same memories. The cold morning briefs, the fear before launch, the fireball of a friend's jet ending in an instant, the pride in doing their duty, and the knowledge that they had faced an opponent worthy of them. The Falklands left scars, psychological, emotional, and national. The Falklands War was, at its core, a maritime fight. Whoever controlled the skies controlled the sea lanes, and whoever controlled the sea lanes controlled whether troops could land, fight, and sustain themselves on the islands. The Sea Harrier's dominance did more than score kills. It created an aerial shield over the British task force, thin, stretched, often desperate, but effective. Without it, the landings at San Carlos would have been impossible. British commanders later acknowledged, if the Harriers had failed, the campaign would have collapsed in days. The air war wasn't a supporting front, it was the front. The AIM-9L Sidewinder represented a revolution. Before 1982, dogfights were still shaped by the classic parameters: maneuver to the enemy's 6 o'clock, gain rear aspect lock, fire only when the exhaust plume fills the seeker. The Falklands broke that model. The AIM-9L could lock onto the heat signature of any part of an aircraft, from any direction, under almost any lighting conditions. For the first time, a missile behaved more like a predatory animal than a machine. This shifted doctrine from maneuver combat to position combat. If the Harrier got within a certain envelope, even for a second, the missile did the rest. Argentina entered the war ready for a 1970s dogfight. The British arrived with a 1980s missile. That gap defined the outcome. Many analysts credit the Sidewinder alone for the Harrier's success. But the aircraft's design played an equally decisive role. Vectored thrust allowed the Sea Harrier to tighten turns to angles impossible for delta wing fighters, bleed speed without losing control, shift nose position mid-maneuver, create firing windows where other jets would stall. Against mirages and daggers, aircraft optimized for high-speed, high-altitude combat, the Harrier fought a different kind of war. It brought the fight down into denser air, where its thrust vectoring behaved almost like an aerodynamic cheat code. As one Argentine pilot later said, "We were fighting a jet that could break the rules of flight." This wasn't an exaggeration. It was the first large-scale demonstration that post-stall maneuverability was the future of air combat, a lesson that later influenced aircraft like the Su-27, F-22, and Gripen. The Royal Navy lacked airborne early warning aircraft in 1982. But they compensated with an improvised, high-risk method, radar controllers aboard ships who coordinated Harriers with near-surgical precision. This created a primitive but functional networked air defense system. Ships detected low-flying threats. Controllers guided Sea Harriers to the intercept. Harriers fired before the attackers could climb. This teamwork amplified the Harrier's limited numbers and turned 20 small jets into a force capable of denying air superiority to a nation with hundreds of combat aircraft. Argentine air power did not fail because of lack of courage. That part was abundant. It failed because aircraft lacked range and loiter time, pilots had limited training for modern missile combat, maintenance and logistics were stretched thin, and their weapons were not optimized for low-level maritime strike. By June, Argentina had planes, but not enough pilots, fuel, or parts to keep them in the fight. Meanwhile, British Sea Harriers remained operational until the last day of the war. When the war ended on June 14th, the world's air forces paid attention. They had just witnessed a subsonic jump jet defeat supersonic fighters, a new missile redefine dogfighting, naval aviation succeed without catapults or heavy carriers, and small networked assets outperform a larger conventional force. NATO planners quietly adjusted their expectations for European air combat. The Soviets studied the vectored thrust lessons intensely, and the British doubled down on carrier aviation, eventually leading to the development of the F-35B, which inherits much of the Harrier's design philosophy. In the end, the Falklands War proved something profound. Technology matters, training matters more, and tactics matter most of all. In the weeks after the shooting stopped, the South Atlantic transformed from a battleground into a quiet, windswept sea once more. The cold gray skies that had once been traced with Sidewinder smoke trails now carried only the gulls and the distant thrum of transport helicopters. But the war's echoes followed every man who had fought in those skies, for some as pride, for others as ghosts. British pilots stepped off their carriers exhausted, many carrying salt-stained flight suits, and weeks of sleep deprivation etched into their faces. They were celebrated at home, hailed as the miracle defenders who had prevented the task force from being driven into the sea. And yet many of them struggled to reconcile the public's view with their own memories. They remembered not just their victories, but the moments when a fuel warning light blinked on too early. The times they searched desperately for a radar contact that refused to appear. The instances when a missile lock didn't tone until the very last breath of opportunity. They remembered the pressure of responsibility, the knowledge that a single missed intercept could turn a ship into a fireball and a landing zone into a graveyard. Argentine pilots returned to a different reality. They were not greeted by cheering crowds, but by a nation stunned by defeat and political upheaval. Yet within the Argentine Air Force, they were spoken of with reverence. They had flown into layered air defenses, past radar pickets, Sea Dart missiles, Rapier batteries, naval gunfire, and finally the Sea Harriers themselves. Many flew without proper countermeasures. Many flew without adequate fuel. And still they went. For them, valor was not measured in victory, but in the willingness to launch again and again into missions whose survival odds every man understood. Both sides began to examine the war with clinical precision. Analysts gathered radar tapes, gun camera footage, and pilot debriefs to piece together how so few Sea Harriers had effectively shut down an entire theater of operations. The conclusion was unavoidable. The AIM-9L Sidewinder had changed everything. Its all-aspect capability meant that dogfighting had shifted from a contest of sustained maneuver to one of fleeting opportunity, where positional advantage for even a second could mean a kill. But the missile alone didn't tell the whole story. The Harrier itself became a symbol of a new philosophy of air combat. It proved that agility, short-field capability, and vectored thrust could outweigh pure speed. It proved that a small carrier could project credible air power without catapults or heavy jets. And it proved that pilot training and tactical discipline remained the decisive factors in air warfare. In Argentina, the war triggered a deep reassessment of doctrine. Pilots had been trained for high-altitude intercepts, not low-level maritime strike runs under extreme fuel pressure. The Mirage 3 and Dagger were beautiful aircraft, but in the South Atlantic environment, fast deltas designed for supersonic combat found themselves fighting a subsonic jet that could pivot like a knife on a hinge. The mismatch wasn't of bravery, but of doctrine. Years later, veterans from both sides would meet, quietly at first, cautiously, and then with growing warmth. They shook hands, embraced, and traded stories about the few seconds in which their lives had intersected in violent proximity. A British pilot might say, "I remember your formation. You came in right over the water, perfect discipline." An Argentine pilot might reply, "We knew you were above us, even when we couldn't see you. You always found us." There was no bitterness, only respect. Modern militaries still study the Falklands Air War. They take note of the lessons that control of the air decides control of the sea, that small forces, if properly trained, can outperform larger ones, that logistics, fuel, and endurance shape outcomes as much as weapons, and that technology becomes decisive only in the hands of those who understand it fully. The Sea Harrier has entered the lore of aviation not because it was the fastest or most powerful jet, but because it was used with intelligence, aggression, and precision. And on both sides of the conflict, the legacy remains deeply human. For British pilots, it is the pride of a nearly impossible mission accomplished. For Argentine pilots, it is the honor of having faced overwhelming odds with courage. For everyone who flew in those cold skies, it is the reminder that war is ultimately fought not by machines, but by young men operating them under conditions no machine was ever designed to fully forgive. The South Atlantic is quiet now, but the stories carried on its wind, the Sidewinders hiss, the low thrum of a skyhawk running in at sea level, the sudden snarl of a Harrier turning inside its own shadow, still define one of the most remarkable aerial confrontations of the modern era. The war's legacy did not end with the ceasefire. Long after the ships returned home, after the jets settled into museums or were sold to new air forces, the lessons of those weeks over the South Atlantic continued shaping the future of aviation. For Britain, the conflict became proof, unexpected, undeniable, that small carriers and short takeoff fighters could still dominate a modern battle space. The Sea Harrier's success justified the survival of naval aviation at a time when many politicians had considered it an expensive relic. Years later, when the Royal Navy designed a new generation of carriers, the shadow of the Falklands loomed large. Every briefing, every design chart carried an unspoken message. This works. We proved it works. Never forget why. For Argentina, the war became a story told with equal parts sorrow and pride. The nation recognized the strategic limitations that had shaped the campaign, distance, fuel, logistics, but also celebrated the unmatched bravery of its aviators. The Skyhawk and Dagger squadrons became legends. Streets were named after them. Bases were renamed. Museums displayed their flight suits, many still smelling faintly of jet fuel and South Atlantic salt. The pilots who survived became instructors, carrying forward the hard-won knowledge gained at terrible cost. Their legacy shaped a generation. Lessons about low-level ingress, timing, coordination, and above all, humility in the face of evolving technology. And somewhere in between those two narratives sits the truth that the Falklands Air War was not a story of one nation's triumph or another's failure, but a collision of doctrine, geography, and human will. It was a story where courage met innovation, where outdated assumptions shattered against unexpected realities, and where both sides discovered their strengths and their limits. In interviews decades later, many pilots confessed to moments of quiet reflection. A British Harrier pilot might speak softly about a kill that saved a ship, yet still weigh the life taken on the other end. An Argentine pilot might speak of the friends who never returned, of the empty chairs in the briefing room, yet still smile when recalling the feeling of flying low over an angry gray sea with the throttle pushed hard against the stops. Time did not erase the pain or the pride, it simply stitched them closer together. And though the war lasted just 10 weeks, its imprint endures. Modern jet designers study the vectored thrust tricks Harrier pilots used to survive against faster opponents. Missile engineers still reference the AIM-9L's performance as the moment heat-seeking combat changed forever. Naval planners cite the Falklands as the case study for what happens when a fleet has fighters, and what happens if it doesn't. Today, when wind sweeps across the empty Falkland Hills and over the cold Atlantic water below, it carries no sign of the duels once fought there. No Sidewinder smoke trails, no thunder of jet engines bouncing between the ridges. Only silence. But if you listen closely, very closely, you might still hear the echoes of two air forces testing their courage against a sky that was unforgiving to both. The bravery, the fear, the fire. The fleeting seconds where life and death danced on the edge of a missile seeker head. The war is long over. The young men who fought it have grown old, but their stories live on, carried in the memories of those who survived, and in the legacy of the machines they flew. The Sea Harrier, the Skyhawk, the Dagger, the Sidewinder. Their names are no longer just technical designations. They are chapters in a story that will be told as long as air combat is studied. A story of underestimated aircraft, unexpected technology, uncompromising courage, and the cold southern sea that witnessed it all. Argentine pilots underestimated the Sea Harrier until its AIM-9L Sidewinders cleared the skies.